Bishakh's work is inspired by the grammar of comics and graphic novels, but seeks to expand the vocabulary of the narratives traditionally presented in this medium by exploring themes of gender, sexuality, memory, and urbanism, amongst other things. She has published one comic collection, Angel, for which she received the prestigious Xeric grant, and two graphic novels, Apsara Engine and Spellbound. Apsara Engine won the 2020 LA Times Book Prize for the Best Graphic Novel, as well as the 2020 Lambda Literary Award for Best LGBTQ Comics, and Spellbound was a finalist for the Lambda Award as well. Her comic work has also appeared in The New Yorker, We're Still Here, Beyond 2, The Strumpet, Boston Review, Black Warrior Review, Vice, Buzzfeed, Ink Brick, the Brooklyn Rail, and Volume 3 of the acclaimed Graphic Canon series from Seven Stories Press. Bishakh, we're delighted to have you. So thank you very much, and I'll hand over to you, and you can share your screen, and we'll get started.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you, Purna and Evelyn and the Heong Gallery and Downing College for having me, and to the University of Cambridge for having me here. It's a real honor to be part of this program and to be affiliated somehow with Lucy Van Pelt, which I never thought I would be. I was, you know, like a lot of fans of cartoons. I was a big fan of Schultz and of a lot of the characters in there, but I particularly gravitated towards Peppermint Patty and Marcy just because of their very queer and approaching trans relationship. But I have a lot of love for Lucy too, so I'm so happy to be somehow affiliated with her. I'm going to share my screen and show you some work from my archives, and also I wanted to do a reading of from my graphic memoir called Spellbound, which is published by Street Noise Books. So I'm going to share my screen now to show you some of that stuff. Yeah, I'm an artist, an author, an illustrator, a graphic novelist. All of these terms I wouldn't have applied to myself like 7 years ago or even 5 years ago, because I was so sort of not confident in who I was, both in terms of my artistic practice and perhaps also my gender. But I'm happy to be in a place where both of those things are on their way to resolving themselves, even if it's a work in progress. For those of you in Cambridge, I just wanted to share some work I did while I was studying at Cambridge for a term. I was in the Department of Architecture there. While I was studying at Harvard doing architecture, I did a semester or a term abroad. So I was just down the road from King's College in Scroop Terrace at the architecture department. And I had a really great, amazing time. This is some of the work I did back then. This is a sort of study collage of a project I was working on, which was investigating the space of domestic labor. And these are the kinds of drawings we did in the architecture department. I've since become an ex-architect after having sort of been stuck in the quagmire of professional practice in New York for way too long. But it gave me the kick in the pants that I needed to sort of move away from that into a practice which involved drawing, much as architecture did, but is now channeled towards the visual arts in specifically illustration and comics and paintings. These are some comics I did for anthologies before I started work on my solo work. So this is an excerpt from an anthology of queer science fiction and fantasy comics called Beyond Volume 3. And this is a story about a bunch of trans women in a dystopian future who control fertility. that's not too sort of controversial a topic. This is a excerpt from an anthology of queer paranormal romance comics about a woman who exiles herself to the forest after becoming disenchanted with the sort of material world and finds a sort of epiphany in divine, in the idea of the divine feminine. Here's an excerpt from an anthology, which I'm really happy about, which was an all-trans comics anthology called We're Still Here. I did the cover, which you can see on the left, and then a comic, a short story for that, about a bunch of trans girls who go to the beach and have a day out. Parallel to my comics practice, I also do watercolor paintings. These are ink and watercolor pieces that explore ideas about the urban landscape, about cartography, about architecture, about scale. So in a way, they kind of take back the practice that I was doing as an architect and rechanneling them into stuff I actually enjoy, which is to say, you know, kind of stuff that doesn't involve, you know, faucets and toilets and having to specify those things as a daily practice. So these are some large watercolor paintings which were shown at they debuted at a show in Helmond in the Netherlands in 2018 before everything went to hell. Anyway, so these are the two books that came out in 2020 that I authored and drew. I will be reading from Spellbound, which is my graphic memoir from Street Noise Books. And the other book that I had out in 2020 was Apsara Engine, which was published by Feminist Press, which is a collection of 8 short stories in this graphic novel format. This is what a lot of the Spellbound looks like. And I'll be reading from that. But this is some of what Apsara Engine looks like. A lot of the stories have sort of fantastical undercurrents going through them. Some of them explore ideas about architecture, representation, and the overlap between architecture and comics and the sort of page of the graphic novel. A lot of them are sort of slice of life stories that take a sort of turn into the uncanny, like this one. And then some of them are about, you know, a lot of them are actually focused on queer and approaching queer South Asian relationships, particularly this one, which is a story called Swandive, which explores ideas about cartography, about queer communities, and about how drawing as a practice can will into being imaginary cultures and worlds, which is part of what you know, drew me to drawing in the first place, is the ability to sort of summon worlds into being, right? Some of which you can see in these sort of kaleidoscopic images that come towards the end of the story. And lately, I've also been, during the pandemic, I went back to painting and exploring ideas of domestic interiors, again, sort of recovering the stuff I did at Cambridge, but sort of injecting it with this sort of hyper-modernist virus, which I took a lot of inspiration from Kurt Schwitter's work, particularly his Merzbau projects. So these are things I've been exploring fairly recently. More of the Schwitter's virus that has infected these interiors. Okay, I'd like to share with you an excerpt from my graphic memoir called Spellbound. I guess my one sort of caveat, or I'll explain to you the conceit of this book, which is that these two characters on the front, one is obviously me, or maybe not so obviously. The other one is a sort of an alter ego that I created for this book. Her name is Anjali, and she's a cisgendered woman. I created her as a sort of substitute for me in the book. She lives out my experiences and sort of, you know, interacts with the reader in my stead. And I did this because when I started this project, I really didn't want to draw myself. And I wanted to create a sort of ambassador from who would address the reader in my stead, right? So I created this cisgendered woman, and I'd kind of been doing that for a lot of my stories that I've been writing. This is before I came out as trans, right? But I think going through the process of writing this book, it made me realize what that initial moment of substitution actually meant, right? It was sort of a stepping stone for me to realize who I was, why it was that I was always using, or why women in my stories were always my other or my alter ego, right? And it sort of made it easier to pass through that gateway towards realizing my transness. So anyway, I will read you this excerpt, which starts off with one chapter called Dust Bunnies. So Anjali, who is me, is embarking on her new life as an artist. Day 2. Luckily, I'd been doing thumbnails of the latest story on weekends and evenings while I was still at Chad's office. That was my old boss, which means I can dive right into penciling. I can't quite see that. Sorry. It's been so long since I sat down to work on art or comics, and this time I'm gambling that a concerted effort will result in a momentous life shift. It's still a little early to feel like a fraud, but I'm sure that will come soon enough. Oh God, sorry, I have to go back here. I've got one more page penciled by 3 p.m. and decide to take a well-deserved cleaning break, seeing as so much stuff has accumulated around my desk, mingling with dust bunnies, ampersand fur, and orphan lentils. Ampersand is the name of her cat, or my imaginary cat. As I'm putting old files and photo albums away, I come across the very first snapshot of me when I came home from the hospital. Okay, so this is a second chapter following that, called Early Years. I was born in Addis Ababa, and this is the snapshot that she's referring to from the previous chapter. I was born in Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia. My family moved there from India several years before, as my dad's job had demanded. Dad was a statistician. He worked for the United Nations Population Division and wrote 2 books on demographics, which are, to this day, still Greek to me. Get it? Mom worked part-time with the United Nations Women's Guild. We lived in an apartment block across the street from Haile Selassie, Emperor of Ethiopia and Rastafarian Messiah. My sister Subrata, who is 10 years older than I am, went to an English school in Addis. We were brought up by 2 Ethiopian nannies, Heli and Segi. Actually had that little lamb as a birthday gift when I was a wee one. I remember only fragments from our time in Ethiopia, riding go-karts with my sister, the taste of injera, dusty Springfield and Nana Muscuri on the stereo, the sweet smell of Segi. I attended an English kindergarten. Subrata was sent off to boarding school in England when she was 12. My folks told me I spoke Amharic as a toddler, though I only remember a couple of words now. Leba, which means thief, and tinish, which means little. Subrata came back to Addis Ababa during her school holidays. We'd play cardboard records cut out of the backs of cereal boxes, build Lego houses, and read comics. When I was 6, revolution broke out in Ethiopia, which forced the UN to resettle us in New York. I don't remember that move, but it must have been pretty momentous for my parents. For the first month or so, we lived in the Roger Smith Hotel on East 47th Street, subsisting on Asian fried chicken takeaway dinners. Good evening, young miss. How are you finding our fair city? Eventually, we found an apartment in Waterside, a strange complex of 4 towers clad in red brick atop an elevated plaza overlooking the East River. Do you like the view, Betty? My parents enrolled me at the United Nations International School, which was, conveniently enough, about 50 feet from Waterside, which meant in later years that I could stumble out of bed 15 minutes before classes started and still be on time. I was put into a bilingual program for some reason. Half our classes were in French, half in English. Mon chat est noir et blanc et il aime faire des bandes dessinées. Ah, mais c'est impossible, Anjali. Enfin, les chats ne savent pas dessiner. My classmates were from all over the world, Germany, Ghana, Guyana, Guatemala. My best friend in first grade was Yuko, who told me she housed a secret rocket in her basement that her dad would commandeer to the moon on weekends. And you can be Colonel Steve. Why do you always get to be Wonder Woman? I loved the taste of her mom's nori rolls. In second grade, I made friends with a small gang of girls, Gregoria, Kaya, and Francesca. Somewhat organically, we began drawing comics on 11 by 14 newsprint. We invented a crew of bizarre characters, a sneezy nose with arms and legs, a woman with a bottom for a head. We'd often have sleepovers at each other's houses. One time at Francesca's palatial digs on the Upper East Side, we stole into her parents' bedroom where, out of a chest of drawers, she dug out from a tiny velvet-lined box one of her mom's glass eyes. See? What? In fifth grade, we were hanging out on Francesca's bunk bed when she revealed to me the mysteries of the joy of sex. I remember lovingly rendered drawings of very hairy men. Well, what are they doing with that rubber band? At birthday parties, we'd play Pass the Parcel and dance to the hits of the day. Sean Cassidy, Sister Sledge, the Sugar Hill Gang. Sixth grade meant moving up to the fourth floor of the school. We were all very impressed with the chemistry labs and such. Whoa, that's some serious shit. Oh my God, stop swearing. Once a year, our class would be taken off to New Jersey for camping excursions. There was bug juice, trust building games, apple cobbler, sitting with some of the cool boys during lunch. I haven't shat in days. With that actual conversation back then. French class got more intense. Our new teacher, Madame Cuvelier, had flaming red hair in an assertive manner. We called her the Dragon Lady. She petrified us mightily, but I wanted to be like her. Bold, confident, sexy. Et alors, cette pièce de Molière, qu'en penses-tu, Anjali? Enfin, c'est-à-dire. I had taken up the clarinet under the impression that playing jazz was cool. Little did I know that we'd end up playing things like Ebony and Ivory and the theme from Rocky in woodwind ensemble instead. Come on, flutes, allegro, get it together. I continued to make comics under the tutelage of Dorothy, who was a year older than I was, and took me under her wing. She used rapidographs for inking. I was still stuck at the penciling stage, and Zipatone, look it up, for shading. Whoa, this is like so professional. Just stick with me, kid. In chemistry class, while the other kids were busy with experiments, I'd watch Madame Cuvelier teach French in the classroom across the way. Hey, are you going to help with this titration or just gawp at her all day? I was a pretty shy, dweeby, introverted kid. I exhibited none of the bad behavior that seemed to be mandatory to a high school experience. My pals and I would hang out after school, drinking Cokes and snacking on gummy bears and Lick-O-Maid. The other kids would smoke, drink, hair off, make out. Our nerdiness exempted us from these particular practices. In the evenings, we chat on the phone for hours about homework, computer games, the best strategies for running the dreaded mile in gym class. My friend Harisita's suggestion, just run as fast as you can the whole way, which I did. Oh, gross. Well, clearly that did not work out as planned, only to throw up at the end of it. In French class, Madame Cuvelier had started to single me out. She lavished praise on me continuously. I would visit her in the modern languages department after school. I'd sit there on the floor just below the fog of cigarette smoke and gift her with records. Ah, the jam. Merci, Anjali. T'es vraiment gentille. I made a new crew of friends, and together we started to get into scary music. Joy Division, Bauhaus, Susie and the Banshees. I began wearing Dr. Martens boots and oversized fuzzy pullovers. We would go to CBGBs to see ska and hardcore bands. I was starting to feel less dweeby, a little more dangerous. After classes, we'd head off to St. Mark's Place to buy records, t-shirts, and badges, culminating in a pilgrimage to Bleecker Bob's record store in the West Village with its notoriously surly owner often hovering about. What are you looking for? Huh? Punk? New wave? Gothic? Huh? I'm just browsing. Dad seemed to enjoy his work at the UN. He was always traveling off to a new destination every few months. Tashkent, Ankara, Geneva, Belgrade. Mom had started doing a master's at Teachers College at Columbia and occasionally subbing at my school. Being proper Bengalis, my folks were obsessed with fish. And the best fish markets were in Chinatown, where Dad would take me on weekends. The Chinese fishmongers got to know him and even picked up a few Bengali phrases from him. Hello, sir. Apni kemon achen? Hello, Achi. Thank you. Twice a year, we'd go out to New Jersey or Long Island for Durga Puja or Kali Puja, annual festivals honoring fierce Hindu goddesses. Every couple of months, we'd visit my aunt out on Long Island. These were sleepy affairs, the highlight of which was preparing dinner, rice, dal, fried okra, neem leaves, vegetable curry, and of course, the revered and much discussed fish entree. Can't they see that these excursions into suburbia are killing me? My attitude in those days was spectacularly obnoxious. In 11th grade, Madame Cuvelier invited me over to her apartment on the pretext of returning her dissertation, which she'd lent me over the summer. She answered the door in a nightgown, shooed the kids away, and made us a pot of tea. We chatted for a good while en français about jazz, socialism, my plans for college. Ah, te voilà, Anjali. Entre, je t'en prie. I left trembling. At the advanced age of 18, I kissed a boy for the first time. Timo, a tall German kid who used to date Bergatha, the metal chick in our grade. What he saw in the likes of me was unclear. He tasted of cigarettes, which seemed very sexy to me at the time. One time in our class, Frances, who I'd known since second grade, told me, Timo says you're an excellent kisser. That actually happened. For my final project in art, I drew a short comic, something about disaffected youth in a record store, and did 2 paintings that riffed on that comic. I thought I was getting pretty good at art and that I would go on to study fine arts in college. It's looking so nice on you. Ah, thanks, Ma. But my folks urged me to follow my bourgeois Bengali calling and become a doctor instead. I applied to and got into Cornell to study biology. I wasn't at all enthusiastic about this, but I thought I didn't really have a choice. You can do art in your spare time, Anju. Graduation day was a bit of a whirlwind. The ceremony took place in the General Assembly Hall at the United Nations. Bergatha showed up in a formal gown, and everyone applauded. There was a party afterward at some hole in the wall in the East Village, and everyone was drunk. Timo broke up with me that day. But I kissed 2 other boys and Harisita that night. In August that year, my aunt and my mom drove me up to Ithaca in a rented station wagon. I sat in the back with all my boxes of clothes and records and read a letter that my friend Neshama, who I'd known since we were 7, had written me. It said, it's a scary world out there, princess, but I know you and I know we can do this. Thank you so much. That's a little excerpt from Spellbound. So thanks for indulging me in that glimpse into my childhood.
No, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing such beautiful images. And if people haven't seen your work before, I'm sure they would really appreciate it. And seeing earlier work and also paint larger scale and paintings and things outside of the comics. So I think it was just such a joy to see. So
thank you.
Really happy. So just a reminder about questions for everybody here. You're free to type any questions in the chat, and I or Prona can read them out if you don't want to read them out yourself, or you can use the raise hand function and I'll call on you and you can ask a question directly. But I do have some prepared questions what people are thinking, and people are a bit shy. So I'll start. Go ahead.
Don't be shy. Sing it
Don't
out.
be shy. Exactly. Yeah, there's not many
Larissa,
of us.
by the way. Sorry, just wanted to say hi to my friend Larissa down there. Hi, honey.
Yeah, there's not many of us, so we're quite a small group, so it's quite nice. So I guess yeah, for first question, maybe to start off, I think it might be interesting for some people here who I know are illustrators themselves to hear a bit more about your process of how you develop. Well, actually, it might be interesting to think about Spellbound and Apsara Angel, because I think Spellbound was done over a longer period of time, developing out of sketches when you're moving from architecture to illustration. Is that correct?
Actually, that's hard to tell. Like, Apsara Engine was the result of me collecting a lot of work that I'd been working on while I was doing my architecture practice. So I'd been writing short stories for a while, you know, like while I was doing those anthology stories. I was writing my own stories for my own edification, and I just had enough material at some point that it began to sort of aspire to be a book. Eventually, I collected those stories, wrote 3 more longer form stories, and that became Apsara Engine, even though I redrew like 80% of the stuff that I'd done in the previous years because it just looked terrible to my more mature eyes, right? But anyway, it's hard to tell how long Apsara took because it was such a sort of prolonged process. Spellbound I wrote after I got Apsara out the door, and I was waiting for sort of responses from publishers about Apsara, and I just didn't know what to do with myself. So I started doing these diary comics as a form of sort of therapy, you know, just to like have a project to do, a project to work on, but also to sort of, I don't know, I mean, feel like I wanted to commit some of these memories and processes to a page, you know, and I wanted to see what it was like to take on the project of a diary comic, which I'd previously sort of poo-pooed with other people's work. And I was thinking, oh, I'm sure I can do this thing, you know, and then it sort of took a life of its own, mainly because I started using this substitute character who then sort of commandeered the vehicle and went her own way, you know, which is nice. But she also like ushered in, as I was saying, you know, the strength of her character, if I can put it that way, sort of ushered in my own reckoning with gender. So it was a very sort of symbiotic dance, which is why I think like the characters are dancing on the front of the front cover of the book. But yeah, it was like I think both books were going at some point sort of in parallel, even though one instigated the other. Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but that's the story of those books.
Yeah, it's really interesting that they were, that they kind of, I guess, informed each other, or one was maybe an escape from the other in some way, or you said like you just had to have a project to work on.
Yeah,
it's really nice. Maybe from that, actually, maybe it would be interesting to hear more about the process of getting the 2 books published, because I'm interested in whether there is a kind of an established community or network of queer and trans publishers and also artists, and how the process of publishing was for you in kind of getting an audience for these books.
So at the time I wasn't out as trans, you know, and I guess I hadn't really found my community. Whatever community I had, I was drifting away from in terms of the people I'd known who were doing comics and graphic novels. I sort of, I didn't want to be part of that world in a way until I had my own books out. So I sort of drifted away from those communities. But birthing these two books also birthed my my gender in a way. So like, while the process of having the books come out into the world was also the process of me coming out into the world. And it's only after the books came out that I started to really find pockets of community within, within the queer and trans worlds. But, originally when I finished Apsara Engine, my sort of like highest aspiration was to have like one of the big three mainstream indie publishers, which is to say, well, in the US anyway, Fantagraphics or Drawn Quarterly or Top Shelf, take on the book. And they all passed, which is interesting. But, in retrospect, that was a gift to me, because finding feminist press and finding street noise books, smaller indie publishers who are more hands-on and more receptive to queer and trans work made so much more sense in the end, right? I don't think Fantagraphics would have known what to do with this book, and they certainly would have not appreciated as much the queer and trans angle that that the stories bring with them. But I was very lucky to find people like Liz Francis at Street Noise, and to find and to have feminist press appreciate the stories when a lot of other people didn't. And also they knew how to put it out into the world in a way that I think other publishers would have been very sort of muddled about. So yeah, I think I was very fortunate in that respect. I think I found my own certainly artistic communities within the queer and trans worlds. And there are certainly quite a few trans comics people that I'm very lucky to know and to be friends with. So, slowly gathering those sort of threads together where it used to be quite frayed and afraid in my previous incarnations, I guess.
Afraid and afraid. Lovely phrasing.
By the way, everyone should do their video, so I'm not looking at like black screens.
Yeah, so many, everyone's names. It's lovely to see your names, but your faces would be very welcome as well. Yeah, and again, to reiterate, questions are also welcome from everybody. I'm just going to keep asking the ones I've prepared, but that is not me taking up space. Well, it is, but it's,
I think Heidi has a question. But
Heidi, hi. I see your hand. Go on, ask away.
I put a question in the chat, and I'm sorry.
Sorry, I've just seen it. Yeah.
Yeah, my shower is being fixed right now, so there's work people in the house, so I'm masked in my home, which feels weird. But anyway, I just wanted to first start by saying I love your work so much. I did a fan copy of your cover and posted it.
Oh, yes. I saw that. That was amazing.
Yeah,
Thank you.
And I taught an excerpt of your work in my creative writing class last fall, which was, the students really responded well to it.
Fantastic.
It was really cool. But one thing that was interesting, and I just kind of was curious because I'm starting the process of working on comics myself and trying to learn. And it seems like, at least in the book you represented and in some of the stuff I saw here, that you're painting like in like a relatively large size, your panels, or like, so I'm just curious about that part of like how you're producing the actual pages, and if you would talk a little bit about that, I would love that.
Sure. There's some of the stuff that the paintings that I showed were, I mean, they're not that big compared to a lot of other people's work. They're like 14 by 20 at the largest. Let me see. Well, for a while I was doing stuff at this scale, like kind of 8.5 by 11, but eventually, like I was saying, I started to redraw a lot of comics, and I zoomed up in size. I don't know if I have any examples. I don't know, I started working a little bit bigger, So these are individual panels that are from Apsara Engine. And you can see, I mean, these have to be shrunk down in order to fit a smaller size page. So I found it actually, yeah, I think I was more tentative when I was working on those initial iterations of the stories back in the aughts and stuff. And I was like, that's why I worked small, because I kind of was a little not confident about what I was doing. And the more I sort of matured and I'm continuing to mature, I think the work got a lot bigger because I became a lot more fluent with the brush and with ink, but also with my storytelling. I think I finally started to move away from sort of atmospheric stuff that just didn't go anywhere into stories that started to have some kind of trajectory. And I think working at a larger scale allowed me to, I don't know, get into the characters a little more and also just, you know, like there's a lot of architecture in the work. There's a lot of environmental information that cannot be done at a small scale, right? So I zoomed out and I sort of started working on details within these panels and worlds that I was creating, especially for that story, Swandive. You know, those pages, I thought I could show you one, but they're tucked away. Those are quite big, you know, and having the space to do that kind of work was something I had realized for myself, was that, you know, I needed the physical space to do that kind of project. So that's the scale I'm working at now. And I think it was, you know, it's a lesson for me that like the timidity of my earlier years was beginning to sort of annoy me and get on my nerves. And I think as a person, I've you know, finally come into some kind of semblance of being who I was meant to be after 53 years. So it's, I don't know, maybe the page size reflects that in some strange fashion.
Thank you so much for responding. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi, for your question. I'm sorry I missed it. I was obviously not paying attention to the chat like I promised I would. So I'm going to keep my eye on it now as well. Yeah, maybe since you mentioned Swandive, we could talk a bit more about that story. Oh, Liz just asked a question. So,
Hi, Liz.
Hi, Liz. Do you want to read it out, or are you happy for me to read it?
I can read it out.
Cool.
Hi, Bishakh.
Hi, Liz.
I was just thinking it because we haven't really talked about it. I was wondering if you read a lot of graphic novels yourself, because I wonder sometimes whether people who are comics artists get inspired by other people's art, or do you like to sort of work in a bubble and not get distracted by other people's? And if you do read, which artists are particularly inspiring to you?
So while I was working on Engine and Spellbound, reading graphic novels completely because I wanted to like I felt like I couldn't quite be in the headspace of working on my own stuff and reading other people's work at the same time. Like I would get sort of either inspired or contaminated by other people's art. And also I didn't want to, I have enjoyed reading other people's work, but I didn't want to give myself that gift until I had my own work out in the world. So now that I do have the books out in the world, I am starting to get back into reading other people's work, even though I know I'm still being very frugal, so I'm not like buying as many books as I used to. I think also a lot of the ways I found out about new work was from conventions and meeting other people, and obviously that's not happening as much or at all. So I've lost a bit of the sort of connections that I had that allowed me to find out about new work. I am discovering there are things like, there are like queer South Asian comics anthologies that I'm loving. There's one called the Gay Zine. There's also one called Bystander, which is not specifically queer, but there's a lot of queer content to it. And it's all about just like what it's like being South Asian in 2021, and how aspects of culture and of globalization frame that understanding of being South Asian. And this is all in comics form. So I'm discovering artists from around the world that thanks to the internet, which is something I sort of rail about social media and the way we're overconnected. But it's also allowed me to find out about artists I never would have known before. So yes, I'm slowly making my way back into reading other people's work. But I'm still strangely hesitant at the same time. Verona.
Hello, sorry, Liz, I muted you just because of the echo, but you can, of course, come back. I was just thinking back, the first graphic novels that I ever read, and I'm in my early 40s, were when I was learning French in my 20s, and to make it, more interesting, would borrow bande dessinée from the sort of Alliance Française library and things like that. I didn't even know that there was such a thing in the English language world. Have you, you've seen it develop over the years? Have you seen, were you influenced by the kind of ubiquity of bande dessinée, and how have you seen the kind of landscape of sort of graphic novels, comics change in the Anglophone world?
So one of the first ways I found out about comics and, well, about the world was because my parents would buy me, I know this is a controversial subject, but Tintin or Tintin was kind of my first introduction into how to become a sort of person, because my dad would buy me the Tintin books from the UN library or bookstore. He would bring them home, and then my mom and my dad would read them to me as like bedtime stories, so thanks, Mom and Dad, for turning me into the woman that I am now. But actually, they would also. There was one book, Tintin in Tibet, where him and the captain stop over in New Delhi, and they have a run-in with like a sort of coolie on the street, and the captain, who's very like a sort of prickly character, likes to give it out, right? But rarely does he get it back. And this coolie shouts back at him in Hindi, and I'd be like, Mom, what does that say? And she would translate. She would read the Hindi to me and translate it. So this is what I mean about the bande dessinée or the comics being an education for me. And I realize now, how problematic Tintin is. I won't go into that, but needless to say, it was, a sort of formative part of who I was and how I began my life in basically thinking visually and just being, having a visual relationship with the world, As far as the evolution of comics, from my own personal history, I went through the sort of usual phases that a lot of kids go through, which is, superhero comics and stuff, which eventually gave way to, stuff like Love and Rockets and, Meat Cake, Dame Darcy, sort of the indie comics revolution of the 90s and the aughts, which is, and the aughts was when I started to sort of become more part of the comics community. And also at the same time, it was like the beginning of my disenchantment with that world because of the kinds of comics that were coming out. which at the time seemed to me very, it seemed like a boys' club to me. And I seemed to have no place in it. So, I should have realized a few things back then. But it also made me want to distance myself from it. And I think since then, I think it's really matured as an art form and as a form of literature, to the point now where there's such a variety of voices in the world of comics and graphic novels that it's hard to sort of create a little box for the medium, which is as it should be, because film is not just a little box. Film has so many voices and authors and people who are from different parts of the world and have different points of view, that it can't just be relegated to a medium, which is what I feel should be the case for graphic novels and comics. But unfortunately, we as in creators of comics have been sort of sidelined as, you remember all these articles in the 90s or aughts where it was like, oh, comics they're not just for kids anymore and all this crap, right? It's like, we're way beyond that now, right? We've come a lot farther in the way we appreciate comics and graphic novels as a medium. And so I'm glad to be making comics in a time like this, even if it's during a pandemic.
There's a question from Rebecca in the chat, which I'll just, I can read it out actually.
Okay.
I think, so Rebecca's asked, please can you speak a little more about how you see the relationship between our bodies and our space? And that's really interesting, because I also wanted to ask a bit about how your previous architecture studies and how that influenced your work. And that was interesting hearing about the scale as well on which you've worked for Apsara Engine. But I'll let you answer.
So I think a lot of the interest in the way bodies inhabit space came from, as you say, from my architectural training or education, in which I noticed that there is so much of a gap between architecture as a practice in terms of its, architects generally tend to take a sort of godlike approach to their project making, right? These buildings are like sort of objects that they create that sort of land in a landscape, in a sort of Corbusian dream of like modernism, of the perfect kind of white alien object that is part of a landscape. And I think that kind of thinking is sort of endemic in architecture, to the point where like the question of habitation becomes almost secondary or tertiary or like even irrelevant, right? I mean, Le Corbusier talked about the way we inhabit buildings, but he thought of them as machines, and that we were somehow in control of these machines, almost like the house is an appliance or something. There's no question of an emotional inhabitation of spaces, right? And I think that even extends to things like the way architects render or create renderings of their projects, which often, in order to demonstrate that these projects are inhabitable, insert these very generic people into their drawings or their renderings, where everyone seems to be having a good time, but it's a sort of baseline, very conventional, heteronormative way of interacting with the world, right? It's very like, this is why these characters that they pick from, it's almost like clip art, right? They just sort of generally, it's a grab bag of characters of it and you slap onto a drawing. What I wanted to do with, and obviously I'm not doing architecture, so I have the freedom to do this, but I wanted to animate those people and to give them a life within the spaces that they are inhabiting, but also influencing and interacting with. So a lot of, you can see it in the cover of Apsara and in some of the paintings, instead of just sitting there drinking coffee, they're actually leaping into the air and dancing and, gesticulating and just being alive. And a lot of that comes from, I don't know, I think for a while I was really interested in the idea of dance and comics. And it's still something I'm interested in pursuing and seeing where the overlap is between dance as a practice and comics, specifically how dance is recorded, like not just as a video, like in terms of video or whatever, but how like the notation of dance happens. I haven't done any research into it, but I was thinking comics is an interesting way of recording movement and dance, right? So I was playing with that a bit, but I didn't pursue it as a standalone project. What I did was to have people in midair within these spaces that otherwise are kind of either conventional or fantastic, and how the two, the sort of bodies in motion and the space in motion, how they kind of also do a dance together, you know? So yeah, and I'm also interested in the way the scale of the body influences the scale of the architecture. So I think that comes from this idea of the domestic interior and how kitchens, for example, you know, there's how studies during how modernists in architecture seem to like, and these were women, by the way, who focused on this kind of thing, recorded and mapped the space of the interior and how the body interacts with that, as opposed to sort of the epic project of modernism at the Corbusian scale, which had to do with kind of godlike thinking. So that's a pretty highfalutin way of addressing the question, I think. But I'm also interested in even smaller scale spaces like train, car, or, you know, like the space of an airline, of your seat in an airline, and how even like in business class, those little pods are shaped to the scale of your body, and what that means for things like, I don't know, like science fiction, and how that there are sort of overlaps between ergonomics and design and science fiction and bodies interacting with their environment. So I'm continuing to look into that scale of things.
That's really amazing. Yeah, lots of ideas. I'm just going around my head right now.
Too many, methinks.
There's another question in the chat from Albie,
Yes.
which I can read. They say, hi, you've mentioned how you lacked confidence in both artistic skills and finding yourself. Fortunately, you've overcome that and become comfortable now. If it's okay, could you speak more about that slump and how you got through it?
I think I've blanked out a lot of the slumpy years. I just kept doing it, you know? Like I was saying, well, I don't know if I made it clear, but I was doing architecture as a practice for almost 20 years. When my last job, my last boss, who shall remain nameless, sort of imploded, and the office imploded with him, and it just sort of died, and I didn't know what to do with myself at that point, but I thought, you know, like the universe was telling me something. So that's when I sort of gave up architecture altogether as a full-time practice and focused solely on art and graphic novels, right? And just having the privilege of that time and space, having my own room to do the work in, and having like being able to dedicate a year of my life to the project of trying to put a graphic novel together was a privilege, but also a way for me to concentrate on how to mature as an artist, you know? Even when I first started that, I didn't dare call myself an artist. I felt like I needed a lot more medals, like just to show off, you know, to be able to be have the confidence to call myself an artist. Otherwise, I had, you know, something of an imposter syndrome. But I just kept doing it. You know, I would just wake up, I would start working on comics, and like I said, a lot of this stuff, right, the stuff that I was working on, I can't look at now, but I just in the process of drawing and drawing and drawing, I just somehow, I don't know, organically got better at it. It's not a very satisfactory response, I'm afraid. It's not like I could tell you a strategy about how I grew. I just got older, which is great, you know. And I think, like I was saying, you know, my sort of emotional maturity sort of had a partnership with my artistic maturity. And it was, yeah, I was lucky to have the openness within which to do all of that. And like I say, it was a privilege, and not many people can either have the financial privilege to do that, and along with that comes, you know, being able to take a whole year off to say, this is a project I want to work on. I realize not everyone can do that. So a lot of it was luck, I'm afraid. Or, yeah, fortune, kismet.
Yeah, I want to repeat something that Heidi put in the chat, which is, I think having the time and space to create is so important for artists, and we don't do well supporting people to have those resources. And I think, yeah, that's really important.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I'm lucky I work on a relatively manageable scale. So like all I need is like this drawing table. I mean, if I worked at a larger scale, I don't know what I would do. You just have to have that physical space to do your work in. So yeah, I mean, I'm lucky that I have this room, even though there's a stinky litter box right next to me. Oh, wow. Thanks, Ollie.
I actually might ask a question which is more material, I suppose, which I was just interested in the use of color in your work, and it the kind of decision, some things in black and white, some things are color, and I just I don't know whether that's quite a small point. I think it might be interesting to
so a lot of the stories themselves in Apsara are these gray washes, right? They're like these, you know, gray washes that sort of have the sepia undertone to them. I think that the decision to do that initially was just for ease of production, really, because I think I would have been overwhelmed not only by the choices I would make in terms of color for those kinds of stories, but also the execution of it, right? Like, I just find it a lot more taxing and precarious to work with color when I'm doing watercolors. But Spellbound, you'll notice, is color, and I did those colors digitally, which for me was a little more manageable and a lot more, it was less trepidatious for me. I felt like, and it's the first time I'd actually taken on a project like that for myself. You know, I'd done some illustrations before that were digitally colored, but I think somehow the kind of flat, but I want to say juicy, but that's not the right word. They're kind of, I mean, there is a sort of candy colored palette to some of the stories in Spellbound, which I really enjoy. But it was more manageable for me, and I was less afraid of approaching the work. And it also gave me a way of you know, the book is not so much about, like, you know, Apsara has its sort of visual kind of phantasmagoric aspects, which are specifically visual. And I think Spellbound is a very visual book, but it's also very story driven. It has its own, the narrative is what sort of propels it forward, and, you know, my story and Anjali's story together. And so I wanted a way to work on the pages that wasn't going to hold me up and to make me afraid with each page, whether or not I was going to, like, screw it up or whatever. It just gave me a lot more license to be forward with the work. And actually, I'm thinking about my third book, which does not exist yet. But I'm contending with this question of color and how to approach it, and what it means to approach it, either using paints or digitally, or whether there's some other, like, happy medium between the two, and how that influences the work. So I'm not sure. It's a question I've been contending with as long as I've been doing comics. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think I have the question of color for me has always been problematic because I was, like I say, I was not confident about it at the beginning, but now I'm starting to like have a way to think about it that allows me to move forward.
Yeah, I want to ask a follow-up question, but I don't know if anyone else has questions. But you mentioned a third book, so if you can, would you be able to tell us a little bit more about what you're working on now, even if it's not the book, even if it's just more general ideas? I think
sure.
Really great to hear.
So I had mentioned, you know, this idea of like these spaces that have to do with like the way the body registers on a space, and spaces that are designed or sort of at the intimate scale of the body, and a lot of that comes from spaces of travel, like airplane cabins or trains, or the way, you know, seats are arranged in a cabin so that it's a very like body oriented strategy. So elaborating on the idea of travel and these spaces of travel is something I'm working on in my third book, which is a book. Well, the conceit will be that it's a book, it's a travel guide, right? It's like Photos or Lonely Planet or Baedeker, right? But it's in the form of a graphic novel, which makes no sense at all because it's supremely unuseful. And it's also a hybrid book in the sense that there will be a character who's walking you through this world that she is the ostensible host of. And you can think of like travel programs on television, like Rick Steves or whatever, right? But again, it's a graphic novel, so it kind of doesn't make sense. And the world that she's investigating is an imaginary city, which is when you spew forth from my fevered imagination, which is going to be a sort of trans exclusive city or vicinity which aspires to a level of utopia, right? So the travel guide is a look into this world from a trans exclusive kind of, when I say trans exclusive, I mean exclusively trans, not that it's excluding trans people. It's a world that is populated only by trans people being investigated by a trans woman who has a sort of dodgy relationship with this world because she's not from there. And what does that mean for the book? The book at some point starts to fall apart as a conceit, as a genre, because her role as a travel guide starts to fall apart as she discovers herself in the process of trying to investigate this world. That's a lot of hooey, but that's what I'm working on.
It's not hooey. I'm really excited. I'm really excited.
I'm grappling with that. I don't even know how to start like writing it down. But yeah, it's a process, you know.
Yeah, I think
also weird to work on something like that when one cannot travel. I mean, one can travel, but like all the joys of it have evaporated for me, you know, all the things that I used to enjoy about just down to the documents and the sort of like quiet moments of travel that are these kind of liminal temporal spaces. All of that is gone for me until we get back to something approaching 2019, you know? So I haven't been able to watch travel shows, and that's why I wasn't able to work on this book last year. I just was so distraught by something I enjoyed doing, something that I wanted to turn into a book. Although all the sort of inspiration for that sort of going into a vacuum was very disconcerting. And I realized, you know, it's not like, you know, well, it's something very petty to complain about while people are dying, but it's I don't know, I guess psychologically, I was starting to just unravel a bit myself also during, while not being able to have any kind of aspirations, and which is why I felt 2020 was stagnant, not because I couldn't travel physically, but I couldn't travel in my head either. And just slowly starting to come out of that, I think.
Hopefully, yeah. I think I was going to say that it's interesting that travel is something you're thinking about when we can't travel, which you mentioned. But maybe the sci-fi element is kind of, yeah, like this sort of imaginative other world. And yeah, I think there's something interesting in comics and graphic novels that you mentioned when you were talking about your work, about the kind of, yeah, you said about drawings potential to kind of bring worlds into being, and I found that really amazing. And that's sort of what I thought of when I look at your work, and especially the story Swandive, where there's the kind of trans-cartographic map, which I guess is kind of a little bit the seed of your next project, maybe.
Yeah, it's something I've been hinting at a little bit with Swandive, but also projects I did last year and this year. I did a project for eFlux Journal that hints at at this upcoming book, and it's a sort of a rehearsal or dry run for that. So if you want to read it, it's at eflux.com. And if you just Google or search my name, you can read a short story that I did that hints at that kind of world that I'm starting to explore. But also there's hints of it in Spellbound too, you know, like, this doesn't have to do with what you were saying. I was just thinking about like, there's chapters in Spellbound that are about travel and about Anjali's exploration of her world, of her parents' world when she goes to India, and how she's surrounded by these, by the idea of her, confronting the idea of her being a tourist, right? And about those liminal spaces of travel. But also getting back to the idea of utopia, it's like, and the idea of willing worlds into creation. I think I've mentioned on several discussions that the inspiration for that comes from a lot. And I think I've mentioned before, this is a very queer strategy, right? It's very like, the idea of creating worlds when there are none that you want to see in the world is something that I find to be very, very queer, as, you know, in the sense that like we create our own cultures and communities, our own, you know, like you take a show like, I don't know, Pose, right? And about the ballroom culture of that time and how it was sort of like composed by the people who were part of it. And it wasn't like, there weren't systems set up to nurture that world, that scene, but it was created by queer people, you know? And I think there's similar strategies that can happen on a larger scale and on smaller scales, you know, and I think that's what the heart of the story like Swandive is all about. And that's something I want to, like I say, explore in the third book. What happens if you blow that up onto the scale of a city or a neighborhood or a vicinity? And what if there are systems in place that make that utopia possible? Does it fall apart? Does it sustain itself? You know, what happens? So those are questions that I'm still thinking about.
Yeah, and those imaginative practices are political practices, and yeah, these world-making, yeah, it crosses both imaginative and material realms, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Yeah, I think that's so amazing, and we could talk forever, but it's getting close to 7. And maybe there's one more question in the chat, so maybe we should make that the last question for this evening. Okay. So Karina, I don't know if you want to read it, or I'm happy to read it out as well. I'll read it, and then if you want to pop in and say hi, that's fine. So Corinne says, Such exciting ideas and thoughts. Thanks so much for sharing these. I'm looking forward to reading both books. One question on travel. Have you and your family ever been back to Ethiopia, and how did your family react to Spellbound?
Oh, okay. I have not been back to Ethiopia. My parents had been, I think they had been. So my parents are no more. They've abandoned this world and joined the Choir Celestial, which is sad, but it also, and I'll be very frank about this, and you can read about it in Spellbound. Not having the burden of their gaze on me allowed me to be who I am today, and allowed me to do the work that I'm doing now. They would, and this is, you know, all my South Asian folks of a certain generation will know this, even though it's a stereotype. But you know, there are some aspects to the stereotype which are true, which is that you don't get much support if you claim that you want to be an artist as a person of my generation. One didn't, right? So I was pre-med. I was studying biology, and I just I couldn't hack it. I really wanted to be an artist, and a sort of stepping stone towards that was doing architecture. So it was a sort of circuitous way of becoming an artist. So the answer to the question is Spellbound and Apsara Engine and all my work would not have been, I don't think would have been possible if my parents were still around, nor would I've had the sort of liberty, and I don't want to use the word courage or bravery or whatever, because it's overwrought and overused, but I wouldn't have been able to come out as trans if they were still watching over me, right? Such was my sort of fear of them, which is kind of a sad way to put it, but it's all, you know, I think a lot of you know what I'm talking about. It's overwhelming. I think it's changed a lot for people. I'll only talk about, you know, people of South Asian descent. I think, you know, a lot, the parents are my age now, and they're a lot more hip to the ways of the world, and that was not true of my parents. So even though they introduced me, you know, I think I got a love of travel and of exploring the world from my mom and dad, because they were so international, because my dad was with the UN, so was my mom, and we were all over the place. Even though I inherited that and a sort of expansive worldview, there were a lot of restrictions in my own life that were also imposed on me by them. So it was sort of a double-edged sword for me. And even though I miss them a lot, you know, I'm not sure what they would have thought of all this, even though in Spellbound, they do pay me a visit as ghosts and have some sort of awakened consciousness, because they don't have to deal with the pettiness of this realm and of their mortal coils anymore. So yeah, they loom large in my psyche, but I'm glad that it's psychic and not physical at this point.
Thank you so much, Bishakh.
You're welcome.
That was, yeah, I think that was a good place to end, actually. Kind of really, I don't know what the word is, but kind of maybe bittersweet. I'm not sure.
Oh, kind of gal I am.
Really beautiful.
I've been told. Maybe next time I can come to Cambridge. We can have a drink at the mill.
That would be lovely. The mill is still standing, so.
Yes.
Yeah, just thank you so much, and thank you to everyone for coming. I don't know if there's anything, any thing you want to say, Prona, at the end. I don't know if there's any announcements of upcoming stuff.
No, I just wanted to say thank you so much, Bishakh, and thank you to Evelyn for organizing
Yes,
this evening. And yeah, the exhibition, Lucy Van Pelt, Director of Everything, is on till the 6th of February. You don't have to pre-book. And we're open 12 to 5 Wednesday to Sunday. So do drop in. And if you want to know what's coming up, just follow us on all our social media handles. They're kind of handled by me and therefore a little bit shambolic, but we try to get the word out. So have a very good evening and a very good afternoon, Bishakh.
Thank you. This was really sweet, bittersweet for me. So thank you, Perona and Evelyn, for having me and for the Home Gallery and all y'all. I'm gonna go buy some wine now.
Yeah, we can have a distance celebratory drink.
Yeah,
I'm starting right now.
Of the world. Yeah.
Excellent.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Thank you so much.
Bye.